You know, when you're last on the program, there's bad news and good news. The bad news is you're getting weary. But how do you think I feel? I died 104 years ago. The good news is I can talk as long as I want. I just don't know how long you will be here. When you think about those years, how do you identify with someone that lived that long ago, George Henry, 1832 to 1914? So let me first maybe bring you up to speed with some contemporary family ties. My grandson was J. Everett Henry. Does that ring a bell? He was one of your Walkerton historians. He wrote lots of the articles in newspapers, and you learned a lot from him, as we all did. He was just passed away like 9 years ago at almost 103, and everyone would ask him, how do you live so long? And he would always reply the very same way: clean living, hard work. Remember the rest? Morning, Catherine. Clean living, hard work, daily prayer, but easy on the hard work. I don't know that he followed that, nor did I, as his grandfather, nor did his great-grandson, George Henry, or great-granddaughter, Catherine Box, or even great-great-grandson, Evan Henry, who's a carpenter too, as is George Henry. So now you know a little of the connection. My grandson growing up here, and we were close to each other. In fact, he's told some of you how hard Christmas Day was, December 25th, 1914, when I passed away when he was only 8 years old. It was a hard day for all of us. I got to tell one quick story before I tell a little bit of my island history. And that was, I got to tell it on my great-grandson, George Henry, and great-granddaughter, Catherine. You notice both their names are up here because Everett named his children after me and my wife. But George Henry and Catherine, as kids, rode their bicycles over here to this very cemetery and rode up here. And what do you think it was like for George Henry to see his own name on a tombstone? They said they jumped back on those bicycles and headed back to town real quick. So you ready to hear my story on the island?
Yep.
You ready to hear my story on the island?
Oh, yeah. Let's go.
All right. My grandparents were James Henry and Bridget Law. They were from Ireland. They came, well, actually, they had their first child in Ireland, a daughter, and then they moved here to Baltimore, Pennsylvania, and eventually to Lisbon, Ohio. And their second born was Barnabas, my dad. By Barnabas, my dad eventually married Nancy Ann Wolfe. And Nancy Ann Wolfe and the two of them had 7 kids. Unfortunately, my dad, Barnabas, only lived about 40 years old. 1944, he died at 40. Guess what? That meant me, 11-year-old boy, the oldest boy of the family, was kind of looked upon as the man of the house and had to help our family through a lot of hard times, some of the pioneer hard times. And so that's what I did. Eventually, at age 22, we moved from Ohio because everybody was moving west. Maybe you don't think of moving west as Indiana, but when you were from Pennsylvania and Ohio, we were moving west to find land, to find property to build on, to farm. And so at age 22 in 1854, we moved to an area, as you know, out here on 104 is the island. The island was a land plot surrounded by the Kankakee River and the Pine Creek, the Beale Ditch, about 7 miles long by 4 miles wide. Totally filled with timber and marshland. It's definitely not ready for farming, but that's what we had to make it. I personally had 120 acres myself in LaPorte County and 80 acres in St. Joe County. Guess who I met that first year? A gal named Catherine Hively. I married her in 1855. The two of us had 6 children. Well, if you ever knew Everett Henry, he would argue that one with you. My obituary only listed 4 names, and he would argue whether there's 4 or 6 or 5. But the 4 listed in my obituary, my obituary was Nancy Henry Huddlemeyer. Her tombstone's right to my left. Alzire Henry Harmison. She's over there on my left as well. Mary Henry Brown. And the 4th one listed in my obituary was my son, John Richard Henry. His tombstone right behind me. John Richard Henry probably rings a bell a little more for some of you Walkertonites. Is that a word around here? Walkertonites? Mm-hmm. Anyway, John Richard Henry was Everett Henry's father. He married Mary Etta Stickley. Her monument's also here right behind me. The Stickley family was a very prominent family out here in the island as well. Very active in the school teachers included. Not only school teachers, very active in the church. So my pioneer earlier days began, like I said, at age 22 in 1854, moving right here to the island area. It's just down 104 here. You can find where my house was built. In fact, it's about 2.5 miles. I just checked it on my horse and buggy Honda coming here today. We were moving to the northern Indiana island, and you talk about farming. It was such dense woods and marsh, you couldn't farm it till you had to take the timber out. You talk about hard work. You can see some of the tools we use for that right here. But I tell you, that 7-mile before mile area, we became a close community, a close family. No matter how many miles you had to go take by horse and buggy or bobsled in the winter or walking or horse, we became family, close. The focus of that island was family, children, community, church, and, of course, work. But easy on the work. I was known myself, I humbly say, because that's what they called me, a farmer, a carpenter, and a preacher. Farmer, yes, even quoted in newspapers being one of the prominent farmers of the island, one of the first-class farmers, and one that raised a lot of fine stock. I'll tell you, it wasn't easy to be a farmer back then when you had to clear the land first. In fact, I remember laying timber, we call them corduroy roads, laying the logs over some of the marshy, wet areas just to be able to drive over them. You talk about hard times. We don't know what they are today. We had floods, we had droughts, we had snowstorms, we had blizzards, we had spooked horses, we had rattlesnakes galore in the marsh area. We had buggy crashes, you name it. But we made farmland, and we raised wheat, hay, oats, potatoes, strawberries, corn. You know, that marshland would grow some corn as high as 13 feet tall. It was an area you could be a first-class farmer, and I'm proud to say I was, and I did raise a pretty good stock. I was also known as a carpenter, and I think it's pretty cool that my son Everett would name his son George Henry, who's here today, my great-great-grandson, who's a carpenter too, a first-class carpenter, and his son Evan, who's a first-class carpenter. But I myself, just like they did, built a lot of houses, built a lot of barns, built a lot of schools, and even a boathouse. In fact, Ira Place over here was talking a little bit ago. I built a house for Willard Place and a barn for him before I even built my own house in the island. Probably heard of my son Everett, even perhaps telling you a few times of watching at least 2 barn raisins before he was 8 years old that I was involved in. I built a few of my own barns, one at age 59, but they were bragging in the newspaper, had all those modern frame on it. I was known, as a pretty good carpenter with nice, well-kept property. Even caught painting my own farmhouse at age 67. But it wasn't just farmhouses. I built a couple schools. In 1868, I built the Dare School. Now, before you get all excited, woo, wow, huge, big school I built. It was 16 by 24, okay? It's about the size of your 2-car garage today. The desks were made of 1-inch poplar boards. The benches were about 6 to 8 foot long with no backs on them. The boys sat on one side. The girls sat on one side of that school. The boys, as soon as the lunch hour started, they were out hunting. And boy, if they didn't get back in time for school after lunch, they got the hickory stick with no mercy. Mm-hmm. You know, the schools weren't much different than ours. They studied spelling and geography and reading and writing and arithmetic. But there's one thing else they studied back then in those schools. Anybody want to take a guess? They studied the Bible. In fact, those kids are required to memorize verses and books and quote the Bible. In 1885, by the way, I was contracted to build the Carlisle School. $550 contract. 17 students started out that first day, and the teacher was paid a whopping $1.25 a day. But you know one thing that was missing on the island? A church. Yeah, we held church services in homes and eventually in the schools. But everybody on that island wanted a church. So in 1874, I donated property for a church to be built on. Just down the road, across the road from Miles, right? If you drive down 104 here toward LaPorte, you'll see the LaPorte and St. Joe County line. That's where the church was, on the right side of the road. It was created by a lot of people. Yeah, I headed up the construction of it, but there was people donating $100, some less, and some just their sweat. But I'll tell you what, it was a proud and happy day when that church got finished. It was a day that people felt united. In fact, it was called the Union Church. Part of the reason it was called the Union Church is it was 3 different denominations that met there in that church. The Seventh-day Adventists, the Methodist Church, and United Brethren. I don't know if that's why there were 3 windows on each side of the church or not. I doubt it, but that's why. And they were united and even getting along together. The handmade seats and pews and the roof sheeting were built from the maple and oak heavy timber. Some of it out of my land, and some of it out of the thick woods down Tyner Way. And I'll tell you, when we finished that church, it was a proud day, eventually being called not just the Union Church, but the Island Church. And it became, to many, the outstanding landmark of the island. Not just because it was a church and all these different churches meeting there, because the church building just got used for everything. Yeah, we had an organ in it. We worshiped in it. In fact, I think that organ is in the basement of my great-grandson, Brian, whose voice I'm using today. But not only was that church used for worship, there were weddings, there was funerals, there was Wednesday and Thursday night prayer meeting, there was Young People's Christian Union, and every winter, you ready for this? Every winter, we had revival services that last 4 to 8 weeks long. You tired already? We called them back then protracted meetings. Protracted meetings. You might have to Google that one. But there was a lot of conversions to Christianity and ascensions. And you can Google that one too. But it was something that brought people back to Christ every winter. There was spelling bees at night, singing schools, children's day programs, concerts and entertainment, and ice cream festivals. In fact, remember one ice cream festival we had where we raised $35, just enough money to paint the whole church building. You could talk on and on about good times at old church. But in 1916, that old church closed its doors. That was 2 years literally after I died. But that was a sad day for the people when they closed that church. Up to that last generation, though, there was preaching every week. There was Sabbath school going on. It can truth be said that church impacted people there and all around the area. The church did not go down either because of any grumbling, griping, disagreements, arguments even between the various denominations or the people. There was perfect harmony till the last. But all that happened is older members began to grow older. They passed away in some cases. Or now that transportation was easy to Walkerton, many were moving to Walkerton for businesses, stores, much easier to be accessed. And then the church is there. So many began to move to the Walkerton churches. So somebody might be asking, okay, it's closed its doors. What happened to that old church building? You probably want to know, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, one of my relatives, Bert Beerley, grandfather of Bill Beerley, wherever he's at. Bert Beerley took that church building and moved it from its location to his own farm. And it's recorded that my son, John Richard, said, well, before you move it over there, why don't you build a first floor foundation and walls and make it a 2-story barn? So that's what he did. That church was converted into a barn. Well, I said I was known as a farmer, a carpenter, and a preacher. You ready for this? They called me the preacher, and I never preached a sermon. I left that for my great-grandson. But I was kind of looked upon, I guess, as the local preacher because I helped make that church, I guess, happen. There was lots of circuit preachers coming and going and lots of different denominations. So I guess I was just kind of looked at that. Yes, I was a Christian. I joined the church at age 32 myself, and I was always considered myself a man of prayer. And I passed that faith and prayer down to my son, John Richard, to my grandson, Everett Henry, and down to a lot of them right here today. I was proud, I guess, in a humble way, that on my obituary it was recorded that I was a Christian man, a friend, and neighbor. Well, before we get there, let me tell you just a couple more things. Did I end up staying on the island? No. In about 1891, I was 60 years of age. And my wife Catherine's health was getting worse. She was deteriorating from what they called back then dropsy. And so we moved to Walkerton. You might wonder where. Well, you can drive by it today. We moved over where the pickle factory was, kind of where your American Legion is today. We bought 5 acres there, built a house where the old Wilcox store was, or where your dollar store is. In fact, my great-grandson here remembers sitting there with his dad, Everett, and watching them burn it down. But we lived there for a lot of years. And we didn't live there alone, because though Alzira, my daughter, and her husband went and took care of our farming on the island, we moved there because my wife needed care. And so I opened a lumber yard there for a while. I was thankful that my son, John Richard, and his wife, Mary Etta, who he just married that year, they moved in with us, mainly to help care for my wife, Catherine. John, my son, opened a grocery store there for a while, but he didn't really like that too well, so he worked putting on tin roofs, and then eventually became mail carrier route number one, for Walkerton's route number 1. By the way, he was paid a whole $60 a month if he supplied his own horse. My wife, Catherine, died 3 years later after we moved to Walkerton, and yet John Richard and Marietta stayed living with me in my home. While living there, John Richard and Marietta had their one and only son, or one and only child, and that was J. Everett Henry. He was born right there in their home by Doc Tracy in 1906. Living together, we got really close. It was only 8 years. But Everett always told a lot of stories to a lot of us. He remembered telling, maybe you remember him telling at 3 years old, up on my shoulders, watching that out-of-town deep-sea diver dive down into Walkerton Waterworks to do some repairs. That was over there where we lived, too. I donated land to build the waterworks here in Walkerton. By the way, we didn't have necessarily electric all the time, 4 or 5 hours a night, maybe until 10 p.m. But anyway, we lived there for quite a while, and my health began to deteriorate. Everett used to tell stories, and his mom of watching me kind of stagger out to the outhouse, hanging onto the clothesline, because I had what was called then hardening of the arteries. Things were slipping, if you will. But this day finally came. And as Everett Henry would say, December 25th, 1914 was not one of the days I want to remember, because it was the day that his grandpa, he was pretty doggone close to, left this earth. He said it was like this. Grandpa, he would say, I was the one that would always pray at the family meal. And that night, Christmas Eve, I couldn't make it over to the table. I was too weak. But you know what? I still said the prayer. Right there by the old potbelly stove in my chair. That was the night we had bear meat, but that's another whole story you need to do a little research on. But John Richard, my son, took me to the bedroom, and J. Everett, my grandson, was sent on an errand. He said he didn't understand it at the time, and it was to go get my aunt. And the next morning, my son, John Richard, had to tell Everett the bad news, or good news, depending where your faith is. And that is that I had gone home. I'd gone to heaven. And J. Everett would say Christmas was never the same, and most of us, many of you as family know that wasn't, it always affected Everett for Christmas Day. But I'm here to tell you what, December 25th, 1914 is a pretty good day to die if you're going to die when you know Jesus. And that's what I knew, and my family knew. Everett went on to graduate, by the way, in 1924 in a class of 9 boys and 8 girls. It was the very same year that my son, John Richard, built a house right over on Route 6. You can go by there on your way home tonight. The corner of Route 6, or Roosevelt and Kentucky, is a beautiful brick home that John Richard built. I don't know much more I could share because I'm afraid you're going to get up and leave here in a minute, but I just wanted to bring a few things that mean a lot to the family, I think, that I passed down, and this is one, a hickory cane probably made right out of the island woods, hickory. And on the far side over here, I have my dad Barnabas's coffee grinder, his coffee pot, and this is my son John Richard's coffee grinder. Some of the tools we used right out there in the island, literally to make what we made of a farmland out there. You might be wondering what that old clock is. My great-great-grandson Evan has that in his house. That was an immigrant family coming through town needing some food. And they offered that clock to me, which didn't even have a face and didn't have any wooden gears. But I gave them a pig so they could eat for that clock. By the way, my son John Richard made out of wood the gears to put in there and never did get it running until Everett made it happen. So I'm going to close with this. As Jay Everett used to say, when it comes to faith, it takes clean living, hard work, daily prayer, but easy on the hard work. Don't miss those. We're all going to go through hard times on this earth. But if you got those ingredients, faith and prayer, family, clean living and integrity, hard work, you're going to get through your hard times. Thank you for listening.
George Henry died of pneumonia on Christmas Day, 1914, at the age of 82 years, 1 month, 21 days. Our presenter, Brian George Henry, is the great-great-grandson of George Henry. I think I'm seeing several other relatives of George Henry in the audience. Would you please identify yourselves? Well, that concludes our tour through history, so I'm going to have to bring us back to modern times, and I'll invite our host, the president of the Walkerton Historical Society, to come up and say some closing words.
The Historical Society wants to thank everybody who took part today. And Brian came from Wisconsin today to be here.
Thank you.
So we also want to thank the town of Walkerton and the cemetery board. And we have, I forgot to mention earlier, we have a quilt auction, a raffle rather, and the drawing will be December 3rd. The quilt was made by June Wigan in honor of her sister Jean and Jean's husband, Joe Lowry. Joe was an electrician who helped the building trades kids at John Glenn School. So the scholarship will go to a building trades student at John Glenn. Thank you all for coming. We have a meeting on October 1st.